This is Matt Myers, and Matt is the Free Fit Guy. And Matt was somebody that we reached out to probably 5 years ago.
It's been a long
When
time.
we were, it's been a long time. I actually was the guy who reached out to you originally was Kirk Tully. He's a friend of mine that was helping me when I was starting the business. And Matt was kind enough to respond and listen to a request from some crazy company in Santa Cruz that's making sandals for running. In any case, Matt, so thanks for joining us today and talking with us. I guess my first question is, I was looking at your profile, on your just on your email, and you've got this giant list of things that you are. But I think the thing that must sum it all up is Free Fit Guy.
Yeah.
So my first question is, how did you become the Free Fit Guy?
Sure.
What does that mean?
Free Fit Guy was born actually. So I graduated school, went to school in University of North Carolina, and afterwards moved to Japan for a couple of years to teach English, which was a lifelong goal of mine ever since I had learned about kind of those exchange teaching programs, to live abroad while I was still young, explore the world. And originally I thought I was going to become a Japanese history professor, which was the path I was on, which is very specific. But had kind of just become obsessed with movement and play, and found myself spending literally every available moment I had learning about it, researching it. So we're talking like early influences, people like Frank Ferencich, who the Exuberant Animal, MoveNat, parkour, gymnastics, CrossFit, weightlifting, physical therapy, mobility. Like, it didn't matter what it was. I was really fascinated by it. And I realized kind of the central concept around it for me was there was something within when I was moving and playing that just made me feel so free and so connected to some part of myself that I couldn't really explain.
Yeah.
And I just kept talking about it incessantly until my wife now, she was my fiance at the time, was kind of like, crap or get off the pot. Like, it's time to, like, why don't you try to do something about it? And so while I was over in Japan, I started training fellow school teachers on playgrounds that were just like around the countryside. We were pretty spread out. I was in a town of about 30,000 people, but I think it was the only foreigner, like only English-speaking foreigner in the town. So I would drive like 45 minutes into the city, meet another English teacher, and just write them workouts, train them on the playground, just try to come at it not from a I love movement perspective, but could I love coaching and being there for someone else. And that lit such a fire under me that I decided, hey, people are starting these blogs. This is back in the heavy blogosphere day. And I was trying to come up with a name or a moniker or something to just describe what it was. I was like, I'm just a guy who finds some sort of freedom from this fitness practice that I'm doing. And so hence Free Fit Guy was born. And then out of that started a podcast, which is, again, these are all just things for me to kind of explore and share my thoughts and my journey in helping other people. But came back from Japan and kind of the big picture overview of where did the career go from there. Took the leap and we're just training people in parks. Came back from Japan and got a great coaching job at a gym in Indiana called Force Fitness and Performance. And that was it. Like, I had it. I've actually was there for 7 years. Created an adult play program called the Ninja Academy, which was about reconnecting people just to kind of like their childlike selves. So not ninjas like super secret stealth force, but more like ninjas, like you're running around acting like ninjas and being silly. And
Yeah. Huh.
and worked a lot with personal training in groups and just trying to learn more about where people were coming from, where they were going, and seeing how I could help them. So was at that gym for 7 years. Became the head coach of the personal training program. Got to travel around talking to groups and doing cool events for like businesses where I would go in and I would do play breaks for these conferences and get people up and moving and connecting to fitness in a different way, because I think fitness has become very kind of in a box in a lot of ways and very regimented and not something that we have to do, not something that we enjoy doing for a lot of people. Absolutely. Which is a big barrier. And then just recently, actually, in the last 4 months, I left that gym and now I'm working for a company called Nerd Fitness. And we do online coaching, which was a big transition, moving from in-person coaching to online coaching. But it's been very rewarding to get to work with people. And a lot of the people we help are at that cusp where they're just trying to start some sort of movement practice in their life. And they've done the yo-yo thing before where they've tried and failed 100 different times. And they're just kind of hoping that this is going to be the time that's going to be something different for them. And they are, our branding kind of specifically reaches out to anyone who self-identifies as a nerd. So if you love superheroes, great. You love sci-fi, great. You love World of Warcraft, great. You love airplanes, great. Doesn't matter what it is. And they come in and we help them.
I got a question for you then,
yeah.
Matt. So like I've listened to a few of your podcasts, and the Japanese thing, like it was a big moment in your life, I think, or a time. The guy who does our marketing and kind of like all the behind the scenes computer design stuff for our website, he did the same job. He was in Japan teaching English.
Nice.
And then my brother, who's kind of inspired by him, because he and Daniel, who works on Shamma, he and his brother have taken a number of trips to actually hike all of these temples. Like they're called henros. They act as henros. And so my brother's been saving up for a couple of years to go to do the same thing. He's learned some Japanese. But what was it that, I have a suspicion, but what was it that like got you interested in Japan in the first place? Or Japanese history? That's quite a...
I was really lucky. I actually got to take some Japanese in high school. We had a high school program for Japanese, and it was Spanish, French, and Japanese were my options. And I just was like, Japanese sounds challenging, different, cool. But the thing that really cemented it for me was I got to go to Japan for 2 weeks when I was in high school on like an exchange program.
Okay.
And lived with a family for a week. And that was another kind of like seminal moment in my growth just as a human, like overcoming the language barrier, because at that point could not speak anything other than like please and thank you and hello and goodbye. Overcoming the language barrier, and actually it's funny how these stories, these narratives kind of weave together, right? Like in hindsight, you can see and you can start pulling these threads. But the seminal moment of connection for me, even in high school, was this moment of play where we couldn't talk to each other. But then the mom, who I'm coming into this experience, thinking about very rigid, formal, polite society. And after dinner one night, she took their sofa and put it sideways across the middle of the room and grabbed 2 giant, like, ping pong paddles and a badminton birdie and started hitting the birdie over the net, like showing me how her and her son played, who was like a freshman in high school. And I was like, oh, this is awesome, right? So we start playing, and literally on the first swing, I whiff it, and the birdie hits me square between the eyes. and all the tension, it was like all the tension melted out of us. We just started laughing hysterically, and the rest of my trip there was wonderful. So I think of it as like that was something I always knew I wanted to go back and just be a part of that culture. Um, but going back a second time, as far as like what I maybe in a different light is, I appreciated the connection with nature. I was out kind of in the boonies, and there was a lot of pride and respect shown to caring for the natural landscape. They had these class 5 pristine rivers running through the area, so like the purest, cleanest water you can get in a natural landscape. And they were really, really big on protecting that. And it was a time for me to kind of reconnect with nature in general, and just that's actually when I started wearing sandals and running around.
Uh-huh.
Was in the wilds of Japan as a young man, and it was just it was a really special time in general. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I was wondering if there was even a less. That's a great story. I was wondering if there was something more base. Like I think for I'm 39, so when I was a kid, and you're at Nerd Fitness, so I'm like, well, nerds play video games. I'm thinking there's like Japan was a really big deal for me as a kid because of
Yep.
Mario Brothers and Zelda and all that. I don't know if you were a video
Oh,
game guy
oh,
at
all
some
that
point.
stuff too. Zelda, Mario, Final Fantasy, like yeah, and when you're in high school, there's probably like a little piece of you that's like, I'm definitely going to become some video game developer in Japan.
Exactly.
And like literally, I think every classmate I had the exact same idea.
It's
So
true.
yeah,
Japan was just an amazing place at the time. I mean, it's still it. I mean, it is for its own reasons, but yeah, I think for a lot of us growing up in that era, it was like, wow, what an interesting culture, and
yeah,
so different from ours, but giving us, a lot of what we were experiencing, some of the best things about our childhood, and
yeah,
the
and
opposite of
pre-internet
movement.
too. So pre-internet, it still felt maybe a little bit removed, right? Like something that would be
Yeah.
like a fantastic journey, right? Because you just didn't have the same kind of access to things. You were getting these little snippets out of the culture.
Is there a connection there with the whole ninja thing? Because
Yeah,
uh,
good point. Definitely so. I mean, I think it all ties into the same thing, like kind of being nerdy, really loving movement, having a strong connection to Japan. Uh, the ninja thing was just, and it was honestly a suggestion from my boss, when I started doing like the Ninja Academy stuff, because calling something like Movement Academy or Play Academy, uh, even it might be a little bit more direct, but it doesn't excite like that kind of childlike fun and glee and wonder. And he was like, dude, you shouldn't call this like Movement Academy. No one knows what that is. Like you should call this Ninja Academy. I was like,
yeah,
yes, this is perfect.
I
Um,
I'm interested. Just hearing the name, I was interested. What is this Ninja Academy all about?
um, so we kind of have these rules of the dojo, but the idea is essentially, at its heart, that play is something that we kind of um, cultivate out of our lives as we get older.
Yeah,
It's like we actively have more and more barriers against it, and that play uh, begets connection with other people. It's a way we develop empathy towards others as we're young, but I think as we're old too, gets us outside of our comfort zone. Is a place where we can grow and communicate in a safe way, where failure is okay,
yeah,
and all forms of play, cooperative, competitive. We're on that spectrum. We're probably a little bit lean towards the cooperative and like the experiential play. But competitive play also has its place, right? For in
yeah.
that spectrum. Um, so it was the whole idea was, well, can I create a space where anybody from any background could come and find a home and a place where it would be safe for them to play and kind of act like a kid again. And really was kind of took our influences from anywhere and everywhere. I didn't want it to become too regimented, but there were strong elements of like obstacle course stuff. So like we'd learn how to fall and roll and jump over obstacles and climb monkey bars, and like we do all that stuff. And there was also a very strong element of teamwork and cooperative gameplay. So games where you're specifically, the goal of the game is with a partner to try to get your partner to work as hard as they possibly can without failing. So rather than the goal of the game necessarily being dominating someone else, right? And that way we could pair up. Like I had a guy, I have a story in the little ebook I wrote on play, called Playful, like playful life,
Yeah,
full life, full of play. There's a little story of a guy I had who's, in Bill, who's at the time was probably about 45. He's 6'8", and he was playing a wrestling game with a 6-year-old, and they're both, if you change the rules enough and know how to like adapt the rules to the game, you can make it so both of those people can come in and have an awesome experience and be challenged in some way and engaged in some way.
And just kind of going off of what you're saying, where you have this 48-year-old and a 6-year-old, I've seen video a few years ago. It was a polar bear and a dog.
Mm-hmm.
And this polar bear comes up to this dog on a chain, and they started playing.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, well, this polar bear's got a free lunch, but there was something. The polar bear had food apparently already. He wasn't starving, but there's something good and really important about playing. And even in the animal kingdom, you can be totally outmatched, yet they still seek this out. There's something inherently really good about it.
Yeah, there's actually, I think that story's told. Stuart Brown wrote a book on play, and he has a TED Talk on play, and I think even references that story about the polar bear and the dog, and how there's some sort of deep innate instinct where play is actually desirable from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Even beyond just it's not practical, but it's still important, and we think that that's probably a lot to do with being able to explore new concepts and ideas, and also develop new skills in safe ways. I think the polar bear and dog story has a sad ending because I know they talk about it, but I feel like 3 days later the polar bear comes back hungry and ate the dog. I'm pretty
really?
I'm pretty sure. No. Because I was like super excited about that story, and I had shared it a couple times, and someone was like, yeah, the polar bear eventually ate the dog. But they did play for a while. They did play for a couple days until he got too hungry. So there's maybe a limit, but
they had a couple glorious days in the sun before it ended.
Yes, they had a couple glorious days in the sun. So it's still good, and still a valuable and interesting lesson that like there was a point where the polar bear was still prioritizing play over basic sustenance, right, in that situation.
More just in the general health realm, like my own personal health, like mental health. I know for myself, like I will forget to, play with my kids, but then I go out and I play with them. It's this thing that, like you were saying, we just kind of push it out of our lives, but it's such a good thing. We don't even realize when we play with our kids, like a lot of times myself, I don't make the connection. Wow, I feel a lot better. I was just horsing around, throwing the kids on the bed, having a pillow fight, playing a little soccer around the house, whatever it is, it brings the energy up, the mood's up, and I get a little bit of health. It seems like it's a good thing, yet I don't always make the connection like, oh, I should probably do more of that since it's so good. I talked to this guy a couple years ago, and we were talking about his bad back, and he's like, when my back gets really bad, I have to sleep on the floor. And he goes, but then once my back's better, after a few nights, I go back to the bed. And I'm like, well, why are you going back to the bed? Sounds Sounds like the floor is the place for you.
Yeah, yeah,
But it's that kind of thing.
yeah,
Everyone's doing it. We should do it. So anyway,
yeah. It makes sense. Yeah,
um,
and I think there's a strong parallel there. It's just like, I mean, ultimately, I think the thing I've really realized from online coaching that I didn't even see as much in in-person coaching, um, I get a more in-depth look into people's schedules and just like this, like everyone is stressed out and over busy and overworked all the time. Like I literally there is not have not found an exception to this rule yet. Everyone is overstressed, overtired, overworked all the time. And so it makes it even more critical to find some more balance and natural rhythm. Like we're kind of operating at this constant like airplane noise level, right? Where
yeah,
you just like that
absolutely.
constant background noise, constant background tasks you're always thinking about all the time. And it seems even more critical to find ways and make it a priority to shut down. And I think ultimately, if you can find something playful and uh, part of the benefit of play is that it's timeless in that it takes you're so in the moment you're not thinking about other stuff, right? Like hopefully like when you're throwing your kid on the bed or you're kicking a soccer ball or you're going for a walk outside or whatever it is. And there are non-physical forms of play too, like board games and drawing and writing and anything. But that kind of loss of time in self almost a little bit, where you're just so invested in it, uh,
Yeah.
seems more and more needed the further we get away from it. So,
So I see this like the one of the big things besides free fit is MoveNat.
hmm
Like what is MoveNat? Like explain to me who really doesn't know. I can kind of guess by the name, but maybe to the Shamma people here, like what is MoveNat, and maybe like what's the difference between exercise, movement, and play, or like how do they all fit
intersect.
together?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so MoveNat specifically is a company that was kind of branded around this idea of natural movement, and
Okay.
natural movement itself is kind of um, a broad topic, right? But think of it as instead of trying to organize exercise or movement by body parts and like types like that, organizing them into broad skill categories. So, like, essentially, what are the skills that humans have been able to do for millennia? And you'll find categories that kind of break down into three big subsections within the MoveNet sphere, which is locomotive patterns, being able to get around, right? And that could be
Okay.
jumping, climbing, crawling, walking, running, swimming, anything like that, right? You have manipulative patterns, which are us being able to modify our environment, lift, carry, throw, catch. And then we have kind of more combative patterns, so like striking, grappling, wrestling, all that kind of stuff. So MoveNat was essentially trying to look at exercise through this lens of like what does a human need to be able to do in order to be a human? Like the best fitness regimen for a tiger is to be a tiger
Yeah.
and do things that a tiger should do. Whereas, so what would kind of taking that same framework and applying it to humans and kind of a callback in a lot of ways. I think MoveNat itself, though, is even a smaller piece of a bigger natural movement piece. MoveNat is trying in a lot of ways to organize the principles so that it can be taught and replicated, and you can be trained in it as a coach. That you could take it into school systems. That you could like have a syllabus. That you could format this in a more formalized way. And kind of the other spectrum of this is, in some ways, is the parkour movement, which MoveNet was born out of in a lot of ways. But in the parkour movement, a lot of people think of it as like guys jumping from building to building, but really it's a scalable practice, and parkour tends to be it's kind of like open source movement. Like it was born on the internet, like on these. It's not as formalized yet, and it's a lot of self experimentation and people going out and finding movement challenges and finding a calling to something, to do something, and and even those are smaller pieces within this bigger picture. So it's all, once you get into the world, I think MoveNet's a really nice entryway. It was a perfect entryway for me, coming from someone who had a very regimented fitness background initially in doing all these like lifting and training for sport. MoveNet was like still regimented and organized enough that I could understand it, but it introduced these broader concepts for me that were really eye-opening. Like, oh yeah, I should be able to jump from here to here. Like I should be able to climb stuff and crawl. And in a lot of ways that opened the gate to play for me, because those movements outdoors felt more like how I played as a kid, right? And how you just run around and explore.
Because none of these, it doesn't matter how big your biceps are if, you can't throw a rock. You can't.
Yeah, and I mean that's the perspective. What's interesting, everyone kind of has their own perspective, right? Each system that you go learn from, whether you learn Kung Fu or Tai Chi or MoveNet or weightlifting, everyone's kind of coming in with their own perspective. And I think MoveNet is a really cool thing. I'd recommend if anyone can go to a workshop, check it out. For me, it was a really important milestone, and I actually think learning from it, if I look back, it can still be like, I think any system can still be a trap in that. And that was what play kind of helped me break out of a lot of times, because then once I know the system of natural movement and these movements, I can organize them. I want to be doing all these specific things, but then it still can feel restrictive and not as playful. So it's just, you got to be, I think, advise people to be both curious but also careful. Yeah.
There's always a certain amount of tyranny in every hierarchy, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I haven't heard that before.
You systemize something and it becomes controlled to a certain extent, and then you lose that freedom.
So if you can take it with that grain of salt, then I think there's a lot of great info there. And then as far as your point about play and movement and exercise, I would think of the biggest fear, assuming we're talking strictly about physical play, right? I think of movement as being the biggest fear in there, right? Movement encompasses everything. It encompasses breathing, your heart beating, getting up out of bed, making breakfast, like, and everything else. Like any kind of movement your body makes at any point in your day or in your life is in this broad movement umbrella. And there's been a strong movement towards movement, a strong trend towards understanding outside the confines of a gym all the things that your body is doing and how that affects your overall health throughout the day, and permanently. So exercise. Go ahead.
Oh, I personally, I totally understand what you're saying. After I got into the whole minimalist running, barefoot running thing, then I just started, it just kind of opened my eyes. I'm like, wow, there's a lot of things that I'm like, a lot of crutches or helps that I don't need, like sitting in a chair, for instance, or like I'm doing right now. Or, um, I was mentioning the not sleeping on a bed. I think that's like a huge, it's like 8 hours where, you kind of, with a modern bed, you're just putting a whole bunch of support under your body. And then I found like when I would try and sleep on a hard surface or a floor or something like that, I'd wake up and my back felt tired, but it was the muscles, it wasn't the joints. So it's like, oh man, there was like 8 hours that I missed out on, just like kind of, I would call it, I don't really have a technical term, like passive movement or something, where
Mm-hmm.
your body, just like when you're standing up, your muscles are kind of moving. They're not like clenching, but they're just kind of keeping you steady and upright and all that.
Yeah.
So I started rethinking a lot of that stuff, switching to standing desks, all of that. But it just opened my mind, like, wow, I need a full range of movement, and I need to, like you said, be a tiger. A tiger needs to be a tiger.
Yeah.
And a human needs to stand up and sit all the way down. Oh, here's my Japanese story. So my friend Daniel, he goes, you know that in Japan, a 90-year-old man can squat to go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And it's like, how many 90-year-old men here in the United States wouldn't fall over and die trying to do that?
I was 22 and I almost fell over and died.
Oh, really? Oh, trying to squat
Yes.
in Japan.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's like, whoa. I mean, they clearly can still do it because they're doing it.
Yeah.
And how much are we like cutting ourselves off from just our natural everyday moving around?
Yeah, and you can almost think of like what exercises. There are many different applications of exercise, right? But in a lot of ways, exercise is a response to trying to we've cut movement out, so it's like, okay, well, how do we get that back in? And we have to create specific places, gyms or whatever, in order to go and add that nutrient, that movement nutrition back into our lives.
Yeah.
But then there could be specific applications of exercise, right? So it's not that are super beneficial in sports performance and injury prevention and all these other things. So it's not a, you don't want to paint with too broad a brush, right? There's good in everything. Is it's just how you apply it a lot of times, how and why you're applying it. But you think of exercise as that little bubble of kind of organized, specific types of movement, and usually exercise also has a very specific connotation in our culture, which is one, most people don't like doing it, and two, the purpose is to wear you out, or like be slightly more than you can handle in a lot of ways. And then we have play, which I think is in its heart, a philosophical step away from that exercise, which we've been kind of talking about this whole time, which is just it's a get to, it's a want to, not a have to. It's a get to and not have to, and when we see people play, a tendency in exercise is also to have very regimented movements, right? It's like, I squat this way, I run on a treadmill in one direction, right? So we have these very specific types of movements, and in play, we tend to introduce a way more dynamic spectrum of the types of twisting and moving and reacting and the opportunities to move your body in different ways. So
you're much more fluid when you're playing.
Usually, and it just depends on what types of games you're playing. And I actually interviewed a guy on my podcast, Josef Rusek from Fighting Monkey, and he has this great quote, which he says, what types of games do you play to keep yourself young? And I love that idea, and both mentally and physically, but also socially, and in the connections you can create with other people. So yeah, I think it can all be, but then other people have found, picking a heavy barbell off the ground, that's play for them. They love the challenge, and kind of it almost becomes playful for them, right? The whole process. So yeah, harder to put a box on play, harder still to put a box on movement. Um, you can kind of think of them as cascading circles: exercise, play, movement.
Like, what is your chief goal, maybe, as a coach? What's your big goal? Maybe you have a couple goals, but
Yeah, that's a great one. I mean, I think really the goal as a coach is to facilitate someone else's discovery. Um,
okay.
so uh, the process is very different. Like we've spent this whole time talking about play, right, and how it's a passion thing for me. But if you went and looked at the 50 to 70 people I'm helping at any given time, many of them might still be in that exercise sphere, and that's because that's where they're coming from. And I think being a coach is about understanding where someone is in their own personal journey. I didn't start off talking about play. I started off in that exercise realm, and that being my total viewpoint and mode of operation. So I think it's just a lot about empathy, understanding where people are coming from, and then um, asking the right questions or giving the right information at the right time to help them move one step further towards what their vision is, rather than kind of supplanting your own. And that's my personal take on coaching. There's a lot of different types of coaches, right? And that are I think are important. Specifically, I can think of a lot of coaches who are kind of more thought. I think of them as thought leaders. Like they have a specific thing, like I am with play, but they might have something that's like so passionate for them that they're a parkour coach. That's how they identify themselves, and so they want to help people who are coming to them for parkour, right?
Yeah.
Um, I would I'm tend to be more that person that like whatever you're coming from, whatever you want to do, if I can help you, I want to. Um, and I'm willing to use whatever method and whatever, as long as I have the experience, right? I'm willing to use whatever I can. So we do. I mean, that could be nutrition related. It could be lifestyle related, kind of like you're talking about. How do I build more movement in? It could be like how do I manage my stress better? Um, I know I just had a lady who told me like I just simple suggestions like I can't sleep at night. I've been tossing and turning. Well, why don't we try just doing like a stream of consciousness journal? You just, write everything down that's in your head before you go to sleep and see if that helps. And like, voila, she's sleeping through the night. Okay, great. That's awesome. And then also helping them figure out what types of exercise or movement they enjoy and trying to connect them into that process a little bit. Um, and eventually I hope that they find something that they love, whatever it is, and that we're able to help them pursue that better. But yeah.
So it sounds like a lot of observation, a lot of
Hmm.
listening, a lot of understanding of the person, and then sort of finding out, using that information to help them achieve what, their potential,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's so much about observation and so much about as much as you can taking your ego out of it. And
Yeah.
a lot of there's a lot of technique to it actually, right? There's a lot of like, okay, we got to make sure we're not overwhelming them with choice because that can be paralyzing. So based on all the
Yeah.
things they've said, can I pick two options that I think either one of them would be good, but allow them the choice to kind of direct their own journey, um, and a lot of stuff like that, and how you respond. And I've learned like your tone, how you match the tone, how you meet emotion with emotion or logic with logic, has such a dramatic impact on how people respond and feel and are able to start something new. So uh, yeah, in some ways, I almost say like it's almost like fitness counseling in some ways.
Yeah.
When I was doing the in-person training, it was so much more about the moment, right? Creating the moment, the experience, the environment, and also getting kind of nitty gritty and detailed on the movement itself and like what we were looking for.
Yeah.
And now that it's online and we're encompassing this bigger circle, it's so much more about being present and there for someone than it is getting caught in the weeds a little bit. So it's been
Yeah.
very rewarding, but different.
I actually have a background in marriage and family therapy. I actually got a master's degree in it a few years ago, and then decided I didn't want to do it. But I was listening to your podcast. And I was going, man, it's just all the little interventions you were doing, discussing with this gentleman about, how to get somebody involved in play, and some people that were a little reticent, like, I don't know if I want to chase a balloon around right now. Well, this, like, how do you, tailor or encourage or bring this group of people along so they're interested in it. And you were talking basically about a lot of like accurate empathy and like, understanding what the person was needing and wanting and communicating, verbally and non-verbally. And anyways, I thought it was really good. So you are kind of like spilling over into the therapy realm, I think.
It's hard to draw those lines, and it's like you do have to draw those lines like professionally, like at times. But yeah, it's hard to draw those lines more when you're trying to treat someone like a human being and like in their total growth and development, while also knowing like what I know and like not making sure I'm not going into realms where I'm like, yeah, I don't know a lot about this anymore, but still being like empathizing and still being an ear, right? Still being an ear for people. A lot of times people don't have that in their lives either. Like we're talking about all these things that we're kind of like missing. It's like I have so many people where they just talk to me, and you can just tell they just literally haven't had anyone to talk to about this stuff ever, and it's